As always, Dr. Reynolds just fills me with like, get up and go. So as you'll see in the program, we're shifting into a little bit of a different space now. So this is where we're calling on our presenters. You'll notice that each presenter has been, will be speaking on a theme which usually sort of aligns with their advocacy work or their research work. We allow about, we'll have 2 sessions. It is a jam-packed day. We're trying to fit everything in. We have a session where about 50 minutes, we'll have a bit of a breather, a bit of a stretch, a bit of a toilet break, and then we'll come back and have another session again of about 50 minutes. I ask that you hold any of your questions or your comments because we actually have about 40-45 minutes at the end so that we can all have a conversation. So if you do have any questions, if you could just jot them down and keep them to the end. And then that way we can perhaps have a bit more of a robust conversation where we're bouncing off of each other with the panel members, but also with everybody else in the room. I think that's really important. The focus here is about co-creating strategies. And it's not just the presenters, as incredible as they are, but it's about the conversations that we're having amongst ourselves in the room and online as well. All right, so it is my absolute pleasure to introduce Professor Kathomi Gatwiri. And I hope that everything's working online. She will be joining us via Zoom from beautiful Perth. She is a research and policy advisor to the AAAC. She's also an associate professor in the Faculty of Health at Southern Cross University. She is an ARC DEFRA Fellow at the Centre for Children and Young People. She's the president of the Pequot Australian Women and Gender Studies Association. Wow, I need to take a deep breath. And a practicing psychotherapist. So she's speaking to the theme of children and family today. So do please give her a warm welcome. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you so much, everyone. It's lovely to be here. It's very rainy and cold in beautiful Perth and very early. Thank you for inviting me to speak a little bit about this work that we are doing and just piggybacking off what Dr. Barbara has just talked about in terms of representation, in terms of advocacy, and in terms of the work that we are doing is really, really important. Now, I wanted to speak broadly. I thought about bringing in my slides, and then I thought, oh, maybe it's just better if I subject you to looking at my face. But I wanted to bring some slides to talk about some of the work that I've been doing with families and communities. And then I thought it's only 8 minutes. I will just talk directly to you. Now, most of you know that I'm a practicing psychotherapist. I'm one of the few African psychotherapists who run a practice working with people, Black people and people of color, working through some of the traumas that you've heard Dr. Barbara raise just a few minutes ago. And my psychotherapy practice has taught me just as much as my academic research has taught me, which is I feel incredibly privileged to have people tell me the things that they'll never tell people, because they're protected by our work and our therapeutic work and alliance. And so I get the insights of what is going on in families, in relationships, in our communities. And one of the things that I found that is then emerging into the research that I'm now doing is the framework that I'm now developing and the theory that I'm now developing around dignity. Now, when people used to come to me for therapy or coaching or support, they would talk about racism in a very interesting way. They didn't talk about trauma a lot. They didn't, even though a lot of my work also talks about the politics of Blackness and racial trauma. But when people came to speak to me, they would speak to me from this concept of every time I experience racism or every time I feel excluded, I feel like someone has taken my dignity away. You know, so the language of dignity was coming quite strongly. And I started to ask, what does dignity look like to you or for you? And because I have a lot of African clients, a lot of them would use cultural metaphors to explain this to me. They would say, it feels like someone is undressing me. You know, if you're an African, you know, undressing people is just like one of those things that is meant to cause maximum shame and maximum humiliation, okay? And people would talk to me and say, I feel like I'm being unclothed. I feel like people are taking off my clothes and I'm being exposed. Feel like I'm walking on the streets literally undressed. And I thought, that's a really interesting way of describing racism. So, or the impact of racism. So I started looking into literature around, you know, the intersections between dignity and racism. Of course, I couldn't find anything. So I thought, I'll do a program of research on this, dignity and racism. So part of the research that I was finding on dignity was mostly around disability studies, where people are talking about how do people who live in disabled bodies or people who are disabled in whatever form maintain dignity when they're receiving full-time care from people who are doing the most intimate acts of cares for them, like showering them and, you know, taking them to the bathroom. And, you know, how do these people retain a form of dignity, a form of being seen and treated as a full and complete human being? So I thought, oh, that's an interesting framework in critical disability studies. I wonder how this applies to, you know, race and the context of racism in Australia. So I'm in Perth collecting data. So I wrote an ARC, I got it, and I'm traveling across Australia now collecting data around how Africans are defining dignity, how Africans are talking about racism in the context of dignity. And the reason why this is so fascinating, and I'll come to the family aspect in a moment, the reason why this is so fascinating is because I think the cultural discourse and the discourse around talking about race in Australia is often framed around competence, you know, cultural competence and cultural safety. But how can you have competence and how can you have safety when you do not have your dignity in place? So for me, it felt like we were putting, you know, the cart before the horse, whereas we're concentrating on racial safety when people cannot say they feel dignity. So what I'm finding across Australia is people talking about dignity as something that is inherent to us. And the UN Human Rights Charter talks about dignity being inherent to us. You're born with it. People cannot take that away from you. It is not debatable. It is not shareable. It is not mutable. It just is. So when people talk about dignity, they say, I don't notice dignity until there is lack of it, because how can you notice that which is natural to you? You only notice that which is in the unnatural state. So people talk about dignity in the context of the lack of it, right? So, and when I ask people, so what does dignity look like to you? And I have to say, you know, I am very, very astounded by what I'm seeing, because I expected people to talk about big experiences, big phenomenal experiences about what dignity means to them. Instead, people are telling me the most minute, the smallest experiences you can ever think of as the expressions of dignity. And at first I thought, that can't be right. It is too simple that it doesn't make sense. And the simplicity of how people of African descent and Black people feel and experience dignity is so simple that I'm feeling both hopeful that we can, you know, use this message of its simplicity to be able to say we can do better, right? So what are some of the experiences that people are saying to me? It is when someone smiles at me. Imagine that, when my colleagues smile at me. It's when just someone takes an extra 10 seconds to just look at me and say, hi, how are you doing? It is when someone sits next to me in a bus, because, you know, as you know, a lot of the things that we heard during the UN consultation was, you know, a lot of people would be falling off with their bags, you know, in a train instead of sitting next to a Black person. And I'm hearing this as a form of dignity where people sit next to me. You know, the person who is helping me at the supermarket smiled at me and said, how was your day? Or, you know, it's people not constantly bothering me about where you're from. You know, it's people assuming the best of me. It is people assuming that I am a good, decent human being. It is me not being expected to prove them wrong in that their assumption of me was deficit, you know, was from a deficit place in the beginning, and now I have to prove them wrong. It is my boss saying, hey, you're ready for promotion. I think you're ready. You should go this year. It is my boss saying, there's an opportunity there that I would like you to link you to. It is, you know, feeling warm when you're walking down the streets because you can feel the warmth of the space. So I'll gather around some of these things, you know, in a big report towards the end, so that I can share with communities and local governments and policymakers to see how simple it is to dignify people. Now, on the flip side, when I ask people, what does indignity look like to you? Again, I expected people to tell me the most profound stories of racism, the most profound stories, you know, these huge stories of being discriminated against. And again, I've been across Australia now for a few months, and very few people have talked about the big stories. Maybe I'm asking the questions wrong, but everybody's telling me the processes of indignity are in the simple aspects. Is when people don't look at me, it's when people don't smile at me, is when I speak in a meeting and nobody seems to see me. It's when I am invisible and I feel like people can just move through me as if I do not exist. You know, it is, you know, when I'm the last option of all the dating options for all the people around me, you know, I don't seem seen, I don't feel like I'm visible. So these small examples around what dignity is, and a lot of people talking about that eroding the natural state of existing in a body that is wanted, that is desirable, that is seen as an addition to the community, right? Now, the framework around dignity then took me to Alex Honnold's work about recognition theory. And he talked about, you know, when we recognize people, and recognition is not a performance. Recognition is, you know, if I can put it in this African philosophy, it's Ubuntu. I am made human by humanizing you, right? My sense of humanity is amplified because I see the humanity in you. That is Ubuntu philosophy 101. And this is what people are telling me dignity is. It is to be seen as a complete and full human being. They're not saying, I even want people to do these extra things to me. No, just seen, just recognized, you know, just to be made to feel like you're a complete human being, existing and supporting and contributing as an included citizen in Australia. You know, so when we go back to the principles of Ubuntu, which is before I humanize another human being, I need to humanize myself first. So people who dehumanize constantly, again, flipping the narrative, what have they done to their own sense of humanity so that dehumanization is the default place with which they interact with Black people, right? So I always say that the first victim of patriarchy are men, and the first victims of white supremacy are the people who dehumanize other people who are non-white, right? You are the first victim because there's something inside of you that has to be dehumanized so that you can dehumanize other people. So Ubuntu reminds us in this sense that we cannot be human if we cannot engage in processes of humanization. Say, for example, the good old framework about, does a tree know that it's a tree? If a tree falls, you know, in the forest and nobody is there to see it, it still fall, you know? Or if I was the only human being on the planet and there was no other human being to mirror my humanity, would I still feel human? So humanity is mirrored through the experiences of other people. If I was the only human being surrounded by trees, surrounded by animals, would I say, still, I'm a human being? Because humanity is a shared and a co-produced experience. So when Black people go through their everyday life feeling like they're not used as mirrors for other people's sense of humanity, then they feel diminished, they feel undignified. And that's a very interesting thing that's coming up in this research. Now, bringing it back to the issue of children and families. When children grow up in an environment where they are not the standard, where they're not humanized, where they feel the sense of dignity and human dignity is eroded by the day, I just want you to imagine the kind of adults they become. You know, I won't go into the statistics of the trajectories of people who've experienced racial trauma, the later outcomes. So for policymakers and the people who are really interested in helping us shift this narrative, I want people to know that racism is expensive. It is so expensive. Because what happens is that from the time a baby is a baby and they're going through the education system, the medical system, the employment system, you know, the sporting system and co-curricular system, and every day is an experience of feeling like people are removing clothes from you and exposing you, you know, so that you're naked in the world, emotionally, racially, culturally. And then we produce adults who cannot function, who, engage in other forms of pain-based behaviors, you know, whether that's criminal activities, or people who cannot engage in meaningful relationships with their partners, with their children, because they're so wounded every day, and people who cannot work because, you know, the wounding, you know, their schema is so wounded that, you know, they cannot engage in a society in a really in a complete way. Their full potential is hindered. So who loses for us? We spend millions and millions of dollars in mental health. We spend millions and millions of dollars in incarceration, criminal justice system. We spend millions and millions of dollars supporting, you know, and engaging people to feel like part of the global, part of the community. So doing this preventative work that Barbara talked about, which is starting from letter A, you know, it is long-term work, supporting our families and our communities and our children to grow up with a sense of dignity, to grow up with a sense of being seen, to grow up with a sense of feeling like they're part of the human community in Australia, and to feel like they are also mirrors to other Australians. So remember, we said your sense of humanity is co-produced. It's about feeling like you can mirror other people's humanity. And when our children are not used as mirrors, they're not able to see their humanity because other people are not able to see theirs. So, you know, part of doing this work is bringing the context of dignity into the way we work with communities, into the way we work with families, into the way we work in schools, but also in the way that we design policies, in the discourse, the way we talk about Black Africans, the way we engage with them, and the way we clothe them. If the sense of indignity is about people feeling naked, how do we return, you know, how do we dignify them by putting some sense of clothes back on them? And putting clothes on them is that smile, is the tone that you use, is, you know, supporting someone who is struggling. It is sitting next to someone. It is not the big things. And that gives me hope. So I'll leave you with that to think about what are the small things that you can continue today to do today, tomorrow, and the days after, to continue clothing people with dignity. And it doesn't take much. So I'll leave that homework with you to think about how you can contribute to humanizing and to dignifying people. It starts with dignity before we can go to the big concepts of the structural and the systems changes that we've been talking about. Okay, so that's it from me today. I hope there'll be some questions or thoughts later, but thank you for listening. I appreciate it.
As always, Kathomi, I'm always blown away by your insight. And you always leave us with a lot to think about. Next up, we have Dr. Alfred Mupenzi, who we at Western Sydney University know very well, even though he is now a lecturer at Excelsior College. Dr. Mupenzi did his PhD at Western and then also worked with us for a while, and I do believe you're still a sessional lecturer here. So Dr. Mupenzi has a wealth of experience when it comes to education and engaging communities at different levels of education. And so we're very lucky that he has agreed to come back to home soil and speak to us today. About 8 minutes. So I know there's a lot to discuss. We can discuss it over lunch.
Fantastic. I will speak in a fragmented way since I have a few minutes. First of all, thank you, Kathleen. That was humbling, and I'm happy to be back. Now, my research was centered on telling people not to homogenize everyone, because it really gives me a challenge when I hear us being generalized. Let's talk about Africa and people of African descent. First of all, why are we here as Africans? 2 reasons. One, some of us came to take refuge, and other people came to take opportunities. When you go to West Africa, Ghana, Nigeria, that's the brain of Africa because they have had stability for a long time. When you go to Eastern Africa, Rwanda, Congo, you will find that we came here as refugees. And we were already humanized. Thank you, Doctor. We were already denied our dignity. And when you go to South Africa, because I have a few friends around, you'll have a mixture of emotions. So when we talk of people of African descent, we need to understand all these different categories. So I'll stop at that. I don't want to be politically right, okay? I'll speak about education. And when I speak about education, I don't want to see educare, giving people knowledge, as a general terminology. I had thought I would use my 8 minutes very well. So I brought friends around. I brought one who is a practitioner in early childhood education. And I had another friend who is also from high school education. And I wanted to speak from the perspective of tertiary education. But let me first begin from the foundation years and welcome one of the best practitioners. I will use my 8 minutes with my friends. So Yvette, would you come over? And Yvette has been a practitioner in early childhood education for a good number of years. And I had wanted us to define what is early childhood education, just in a minute or two.
Oh, wow. I didn't come prepared. It's right. Okay. How do you sum up what is early childhood? I go back to the concept of early childhood. The concept of childhood is only, but that's in Western culture. And I think as well, if we talk about childhood within many other cultures, we may not even have childhood established. We're talking about infancy to adulthood. And there's this blurred line. So I think when we talk about childhood, what is that foundation? Wow, we don't have all that data yet, I don't think. But what we talk about is memories, nostalgia. What does that mean for us? And every one of us has a story, and it shapes us who we are. And I think those first 5 years are powerful. And when we can actually have a strong foundation for early childhood, we're setting children up for success in their adult years, and hopefully minimizing mental health, and we're strengthening resilience, all those skills there.
Early childhood as foundational years and formative years, I would say I missed most of that, because for the 17 years of my first years of life, I was a refugee and in a refugee camp. The best we could ever do, we had play. We had soccer every day, from morning to sunset. We were physically fit and we were healthy, because one nutritionist told me the best nutrition is not to eat. So, but I know most of us are avoiding food so that to keep in shape, but that's not what I mean actually. For us, we had to hunt for food. We had to find food. So in my formative years, I wouldn't give you much, but tell you that I was loved, cared for, had peers, we had fun. Now bring African descent children to Western culture. And until recently, I had a professor who challenged my perspective. He said, we are so much like taken up by individualism. But actually, I don't see that theory as true. Because I have a family, I'm not an individual. I have a church I go to, I'm not an individual. And I have a workplace where I have friends and peers. I'm not an individual. I am collective as well. But in the African perspective, it takes a whole village to raise a child. And so you bring a child into this society where they don't have a church, they don't have a belonging, they don't have a sense of being, and they don't have a sense of becoming. And then you question why we have so many detention centers. So I know minutes are very few, but at the same time, when we are unpacking racism, when we are unpacking issues of justice, we have to take foundational level as well. Law is just. People are unjust. We just have to look at who is causing that injustice, not what the law says. The law is purely, most of these young people in detention centers have done one thing or two not right. But the question is, why? Maybe they didn't have a community. Maybe they didn't have a family. Maybe they are not feeling that sense of being, becoming, and belonging. So education is broad, but I can speak only and only to informal education, African true indigenous education, where we sat with our parents and they gave us that education, where we went through the communities and we got that education. And then we become isolated as refugees in foreign lands, and then we think that we remain African, pure breed. No. Times have changed. We are now a global village. We need to change our perspectives. I know I could have presented much more than I could, but in the interest of time, I will tell you that education is foundational. but you can only give what you have. Most of the parents who come here from refugee background, for example, have not had a chance to acquire education. How will they be the foundation for their children to acquire education? There is a disconnect in public-private education when you come to Australia. In public education, there's that sense of like getting yourself out, but in some senses, we need someone to push us. And from our perspective, most of us who are here from African descent have been pushed by someone to acquire what you have acquired. And some of us, children, students, I have 4 of them. I'm a father of 4, 19, 17, 15, and 18 months. And so I know what I'm speaking about. My 19-year-old came here when he was 10, and I've struggled through to make him understand that. My 17-year-old is sitting at year 12. I'm still pushing. My 15-year-old is still trying. I don't know what will become of my 18-year-old, but thank you for that.
Alfred, as always, you put a smile on our face and you really make us think about what it means to be educated and how education is transmitted and how we think beyond our kind of Western understanding of what education is as well. And I think that's really important. Next up, we have newly Dr. Sarah Williams. Sarah is a member of the AAAC as well, and the Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology. She has worked as an intercultural community development practitioner and a youth worker for over a decade. And I'm absolutely delighted she's come all the way from Melbourne after a harrowing trip here last night. So I'm so glad that you're here. Please do come up and share your thoughts.
Womanjika, I brought this word to you from the Woiwurrung language of Wurundjeri people of the Kulin lands, from Melbourne, where I come from. Why am I here, you may be wondering. It's important to think about a national perspective. I know this is a localised symposium today, but I have been reflecting on the process to give witness when we had the Barbara and her friends come to Melbourne. And that moment to me was a very emotional moment. In September last year, I had attended 3 funerals of young people of African descent in the 1 month. And this was in line with about 10 funerals that I've attended over the last decade of young people, mostly young males. And in December, this was a moment to give witness. It felt like a moment in Australia where we don't often have this concept of truth telling, even though we've been doing it for centuries. A moment where people were actually listening to your work that you've been doing for centuries, but it felt like a pivotal time. And the idea of reconciliation often means to assume that you had a relationship to begin with. When we reflect in the lands we now call Australia, maybe that is present, maybe it's not. And when I've been talking to some politicians just initially about the UN recommendations, this relationship is pivotal. Some have felt accused in the language of the UN recommendations, or have had a very interesting reaction. And so this concept of reconciliation to me is important when we think about young people's experiences, lived experiences, and to think about how can we build that relationship. So like Kathomi, and thanks for that, that concept of Ubuntu also came to mind, because why am I here? When I think about my friends, mostly young people from South Sudanese backgrounds, I had the opportunity to visit South Sudan on 3 occasions and have been friends for over a decade. Some of my friends did migrate or came on forced refugee visas from the years 2004 to 2007. And my witness at the UN opportunity was to share about the concept of integration. Some of you may remember the murder of Liep Goyen in Noble Park. It's just in my hood where I live in Dandenong, it's down the road, where the profiling in Australian media and politics became about gangs questioning people's ability to integrate into Australian society and that they were criminals without reform. I met many young rappers, and I love that Barbara mentioned the idea of hip hop, who have a voice and they didn't have many opportunities to share that voice in public spaces. And so I'm going to play a short video because it's important to represent the voices of young people here today. But just to frame that video, the other witness that I wanted to share was, I guess, a case study which really signifies the umbrella topic that Barbara and her colleagues spoke about of systemic racism. That word racism was the R word not long ago in our Australian knowledge or memory. We couldn't really say it. And I have noticed that there is a dialogue happening, but there is a different opinions on the prevalence and how we frame that. So I'm here because I'm sharing from an anti-racist perspective to give witness, I guess, from a person of whiteness, to acknowledge that race is a social construct. It does not exist. We are all dignified people. And if we share that dignity and don't walk away and bear witness to that relationship, then it's a profound opportunity. And that will come to where I'll finish off with recommendations today. So I'm hoping this works.
I'm dark skinned, really dark skinned.
You feel like you're representing your skin color for everyone that's just like you. So you have to be this extra nice person, like extra smile. Even if you're not feeling it that day, you just have to have a smile on, because if you don't, you look scary.
The way I got into music was really through having to learn English, getting into the power of words, what words could do to people and how it could make people feel some type of way.
Damn, we amazing. Melanin be popping, even 2020 with your vision. Now look at us, black excellent.
I definitely believe that hip hop now, it's given a lot of us a chance to really feel like there's room for us, you know?
Show them every day that I'ma rise up. We gon' be okay. Changes every day. Living every day like we're living for today. Now we gon' be okay. Changes every day. We're living every day like we're living for today. Now.
Everyone may recognize this video. She was helping to edit it. And these are my community, my friends, people I've been journeying with. And I feel that presence here today, as I mentioned, it's an emotional moment to honour their lived experience and their lives and their voice through hip hop in particular and conscious hip hop. But the case study I spoke about, I think, signifies the stages of systemic racism. A family that I used to work with from the Southern Migrant Refugee Centre in Dandenong came from South Sudan. They were from a tribal group in South Sudan. The prominent tribal groups are Dinka and Nuer, and they came from a very remote area in South Sudan. A mum with her two young boys who were about 12 and 14 at the time, and she also had older boys who were already finished or not in school. I live in kind of a lower socio-economic area around the Dandenong area in Melbourne, and from a school age, the young boys were already struggling with forms of identity, peer networks, and generally wandering around the community. Her mum, and I won't use her name, but I do hold her in my heart, moved to Morwell to try to gain a better life for her boys, who are now starting to get involved in criminal justice system at the age of 12. Sadly, their mum had severe mental health issues, and Kathomi's already spoken about how that could come about. Their mum passed away, sadly, through a very death that could have been prevented. And I won't share the details because I'm not here to talk about shock horror stories, but I think this story really represents now how these young boys are now on Christmas Island. One in particular has been detained indefinitely. through our character laws. And when you start to see the story and you see the remote part of South Sudan, their journey through Kenya, life in Australia as young people, and now in Christmas Island indefinitely, I was part of a case where I was giving this kind of academic witness. And so my recommendations, although I've talked about a deficit and a very severe story of funerals and death, some of you, this will be like Community Development 101 and you're like, duh, this is like already what we're doing. But to be honest, when you talk about youth work and youth participation, it's not always the case. So I'm going to try to wrap it up quickly with these recommendations. But I kind of drew on the concept of born to stand out. Instead of that idea of fitting in or integrating or having to become white to be a part of Australia, this concept of born to stand out. I love the imagery of Thomas Sankara in Burkina Faso, who renamed Burkina Faso, which is roughly translated as towards standing upright. And I think that's a beautiful narrative that we're bringing from Kathomi onwards today, a dignified resolution. So lived experience narratives were captured by the UN, but I felt like being there, they weren't documented for the general public. And I do think about the idea of truth-telling to have that safe space was important for that moment. But the reason why allies and some of us here are documenting through video and sharing a roadmap, we've got a research assistant here, Shepo, who's documenting. We have Dennis, a social work student from RMIT, and Shan. We're all in this together to try to capture this very important time in history. So lived experience narratives are going to be very important. There is a lack of data. And one of the data that I found through my PhD was that the Herald Sun had reported the Apex gang on 135 occasions in the 1 year. So you can imagine if these racialized narratives of criminals, gangs not fitting in have been perpetuated for over a decade, that this becomes truth, even though, as we know, it's not true. So the idea of communicating social change is, how do we understand social change if it's not documented or reported publicly? So having video or digital ethnography is one way. And so thank you for having us today to share this with the general public. In academia, we don't always get to share, it's kind of in a silo. I'm going to finish on just conceptualizing youth. And one thing I feel that is missed in our discourse around multiculturalism. Sadly, and you might be offended, but bear with me on this, multiculturalism is kind of an outdated term in terms of how we understand young people and migrant or youth identities in general. So I've been thinking about the language of transcultural or intercultural identities, and to finish up with these young boys. They had to be one way at school. They had to be one way when they went home. They had to be one way when they went on the train station and were racially profiled by the PSO officers. They had to be one way when they came to my youth centre to have a drop-in session. They were another way when they were recording their music. And if you imagine this as a daily experience, I can see how you would feel your clothes are taken off, to use the metaphor from Kathomi. And it is very sad, but I think through youth participation and the way we frame our grant funding, the way we frame agency, these are young people who are already doing amazing things in Melbourne. During Black Lives Matter, they were organising protests, organising events, and we should listen to them. So I'd love to keep in touch with you and continue this national conversation. Thank you.
Sarah, thank you so much. And I'm absolutely delighted that you did make it here in person, because that was hard going yesterday. But I think one of the sort of clear points in the findings and the recommendations is that the youth are falling through the gaps. and that we need to think about how we're engaging them in meaningful ways and meeting them where they're at as well. And I think that the work that you're doing is so incredibly important in that space. So again, yay that you're here to share. Now it is my absolute pleasure to welcome Associate Professor Olayide Ogunsiji. We are so very lucky to have her here. She is Associate Professor at the School of Nursing and Midwifery at Western Sydney University. She's a registered nurse as well, so she comes to it from a practitioner's perspective when we're talking about these issues. Her research interests are focused on migrant and refugee health, and she's worked incredibly closely with African women on various health issues. She is also leading the African strategy at Western Sydney University, and part of that strategy is engaging with African communities within our region. And I think that that is really important for us to state as well, because you come at it from such a varied perspective. And I'm absolutely delighted that you're here to talk about physical and mental health. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kathleen, and good morning again, everyone. Also acknowledge the traditional owners of the land in which we are, and we are seated here this morning. We appreciate them and thank them for all that they allow us to do on their lands. My own task this morning is very simple, because Dr. Kathleen Openshaw made it very simple. He said I should just go straight to basics. And two things I need to focus on are how can we utilize a strength-based approach in translating the high-level recommendations to actions. That's number one. And how can you and I prioritize the action at all levels, whether at the local government level, state level, and the federal government level. You can see that all the speakers have said a lot about the recommendations and all the issues that are out there. And having said that, sorry about this, having said that, how do we make the conversation pretty simple, strength-based? How do you and I see ourselves in the bigger picture of the recommendations, and then ensure that we make it a daily translation of recommendation to action? I come here, with a lot of research that I've done, just like Kathleen has said, among migrants and refugees, specifically African migrants and refugees, families, and even in the area of mental and physical health, which is highly profiled in the recommendation. Come to think about everything we have been saying and all that a number of us have read in terms of what it means for an individual to find himself starting with beginning again in a new country. That was the very first research that I did when I came after my PhD, actually. You've got so much wealth of experience and knowledge, skills, well-trained in your country of birth, and you now come to Australia and you are either hearing you don't have local experience or you are overqualified. So those are important things that were actually mentioned in the recommendation that you would have read, as well, which then means that there is no consistency in terms of how you are disqualified from being employed. So it's either they say, okay, you don't have local experience. Oh yeah, that's really true. I'm only new in Australia, even though I'm not new in the world. Even though I'm not new, they saw my qualification before I got the visa and everything. Oh yeah, that's true. I don't have the local experience. Then you now feel rejected, dejected, depressed, and say, oh my God, where do I start again? Or, all right, I'm equipped with everything that they need. I've done this training, I've got this, I've got this, I've got that, and all the rest. I now present this, you are overqualified. Oh my goodness, where to again? Hitherto, no local experience. Now, overqualified. Where do I stand? So all those together with the stressors of settling a new country, migration, and all that, all the previous speakers have spoken about, tend to play significantly on people's mental and physical health. Mental health starts with, and then physical health in terms of how do I present myself? How do I explain myself when I've got XYZ health issues? And all that, previous speakers have in terms of dignity, how do I put my mouth and say something about what I'm passing through? Those are all ongoing conversations that we are all aware of. And whether we are aware or not, Africans in Australia, we are growing in population. I'm aware that even though the statistics might not actually be an actual representation of the number of Africans in Australia, but what we got in official documents shows that in 1996, people of African descent are 147,876, and you can see how we have grown in 2006 and 2016. Looking forward to that figure actually being updated. So that is to say that when we are considering people that are living with mental health issues and challenges with physical health, whether in terms of accessing the services, whether in terms of early presentation for hospital care, or even in terms of promotion of their health, the number of people of African descent is increasing. And if no adequate attention is paid to their health and issues that have to do with, their well-being, it continues to increase the healthcare costs and healthcare budget. And so, whether from the policymakers' perspective or from you and I's perspective, it makes sense to actually listen to people of African descent. So, simple tasks that have been given, like I said, how can we use strength-based approach? And I was thinking about how do we really use strength-based approach? It starts with you and with me. Over the years, we have been made to, perhaps see ourselves as being vulnerable, incapable, we are lacking so many things, we are refugees and asylum seekers and all the rest. But then, many of the refugees are specialists in their countries of birth. Before was, actually struck. And I hope it doesn't happen at all in any other part of the world, but God forbid anything happens in Australia and everybody has to run. And maybe English-speaking, individual now find himself in Iran or Afghanistan. He or she becomes an illiterate all over again. Because maybe Arabic they speak there and you're not able to speak that language. What will that look like? So there is need for you and I to recognize and acknowledge the core knowledge and skills that you and I have as people of African descent. People of African descent, I guess maybe because of the audience that I'm speaking to, and for obvious reason of who I am, and for what even the UN working group of experts has spoken together, there is a lot of tremendous professional skills that we are all having, we are endowed with. But except we recognize that, we will continue to go around with our heads dropped, thinking that we are the number one on the list for people to pity or for people to be considered as incapable. So, using strength-based approach starts with that recognition. It starts with you and I, and everyone supporting and empowering one, and also use the strategy of unity rather than division. We all know there are 54 countries in Africa. And many often what I see and what I hear is, oh, you are not a Ghanaian, you are in Nigeria. You are not an Ethiopian, you are in South Sudanese. And as we go like that, it's like we devalue and reduce the critical strength that we can all put together. And many times we see ourselves as maybe a lone ranger that you are alone. It's only about me. Let's look at different instances, so to speak. Somebody that wants to bring in food from overseas. And many of these food are actually organic and healthier than what we have here. And you get to the airport and they say, drop this, drop that. Don't just keep them, but drop in the bin, drop in the bin, drop in the bin. When you feel lonely and all alone, what you do is to put everything in the bin without evidence. But when we see ourselves using the strength-based approach, we will recognize that there is somebody there that I can talk to or speak to. And I'm so glad that we are all gathered here this morning, and it's really showing that you are not alone, and I am not alone. Just for instance, somebody told me that there is this particular, very rich protein-filled, African, kind of ingredient that they said is fattening, and you put it in the bin. It is melon kind of thing. They said it's fattening. I said it's not as fattening as all the I don't know that we buy in Woolworths. So it is about taking the time to really understand the chemical and whatever components of this food, and it all starts from strength-based approach. But who's going to do that for you? Who's going to do that for Australia, where you and I are today? It is you, it is me. Let's take interest rather than, I'm only dealing with my own issue. What you are passing through does not really concern me. So I'm making it as simple as that. Now, strategies to ensure prioritization across all levels. I think it was Barbara that spoke a lot about it. She was reading my mind, promote, share, educate all the knowledge that we have got. Maybe you have had the experience of all the rich proteinous, carbohydrates, or whatever healthy food items that you are bringing and being dropped in the bin at the airport level. Why don't you take the bin to work together with a dietitian or somebody in that area, so that we can now have a compilation of the chemical components or calorie components of those food items, and then share the knowledge. My experience so far in Australia is that we have hearing ears in research, in promoting what we are ready to share. But when nobody shares it, when nobody says anything about it, then it continues to be something that nobody knows about. So at every level, wherever and whatever state we find ourselves, let us share the knowledge. Let's promote health. Let's educate. Mental health issue, for example, it starts with you and I in making that particular health issue, moving from being a taboo topic to becoming a topic that we freely discuss. But when you as a family member say, oh, don't talk about it. Don't talk about it. I don't want anybody to know that this is what you are living with. It will continue to cripple the family and put a lot of pressure on the society. And that goes on and on. So what am I saying? Making it simple. See that translating the recommendation to action starts with you and start with me. Promote the knowledge that you have. Share it. Let everyone know about it. And that's it from me.
Thank you so much, Associate Professor. I think it's so important that we do receive those reminders about the connection between mental health and our physical health, because one impacts the other, and you cannot have one in isolation without dealing with the other. And I think it's so important that there's work being done in this space. I also think it's really important, we've heard it a couple of times today, how not having these conversations, not dealing with these challenges, and racism full stop is actually expensive. And so if we're going to think about, you know, a cost of living crisis, I think we need to start working on these things. Now, I know we need a bit of a walk around, a bit of a breather, a bit of a shaking off, maybe a restroom break. We are running a little bit behind, as I expected, but we all have a lot to say. So can I ask that you're back here in about 5 minutes? So what time is that? About 11:25 for a bit of a stretch.
River. Sorry, that's flowing past us today, the place of the eel. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present and extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today. So I was invited to speak today on the theme of challenging racism in everyday contexts. And as just mentioned, I'm an academic researcher at the Challenging Racism Project, and central to our work is doing just that, challenging racism in everyday contexts. So I hope I can provide some insights on what can be achieved using a strengths-based approach to the co-creation of what we at the CRP, Challenging Racism Project, call anti-racism interventions. So at the Challenging Racism Project, we pride ourselves on guiding and grounding our safe and effective anti-racism interventions in research, in our research. And these interventions have included anti-racism mobile phone apps, documentaries made in collaboration with SBS, and our flagship offering, which is bystander anti-racism training. Oh, there's my cover slide, sorry. So our bystander anti-racism training draws upon our latest research, as well as international research and theory on racism and anti-racism. And we've facilitated these workshops across Australian schools, local government councils, corporates such as the big banks, sports clubs, and various NGOs. And during these training sessions and via other mediums, we advocate what is called bystander anti-racism action. Bystander is a contentious term, but we'll keep going with it today. So bystander anti-racism action, it's an active process that disrupts normalised situations of everyday racism. It shifts the burden of responsibility in dealing with racism away from the target, because it's up to the witness or bystander to do something about it. So what do we advocate bystanders or witnesses to racism to do? We advocate for them to check in, to reach out to the target of racism, see how they are and what kind of support they may need. To call it out if it's safe to do so. That means let the perpetrator know what they did was not okay. It was offensive. It made people feel unsafe and uncomfortable. To report it, to collect and document evidence that can be reported to the right people, making sure, of course, that you have the consent of the target to do so. And finally, to talk about it. We've spoken about this a bit today. That's what we're doing today is we're talking about it. Have conversations with colleagues, friends, family, and your communities to raise awareness about what racism is, its impacts, and what we can all do to combat it. Anti-racism is all of our responsibility, but particularly those of us with more societal privilege and power. I also want to share with you a current project that I've been leading. I call it for shorthand the COVID Racism Project. The full title is up on the screen. And I want to share this project with you today because I think it speaks to the heart of what a strengths-based, co-created anti-racism intervention can look like. Also, because I believe the experiences of Asian Australians, Asian Australian communities that I belong to, and which was the focus of this study, have some similarities to the African diaspora communities in Australia. For example, both have long-standing historical presence in Australia. Individuals across the communities have similar settler colonial positions in Australia and continue to experience racism and various forms of intersectional discrimination within the settler colonial state. And both experience waves of racism that are closely aligned to geopolitics and national and international events. So while we should and can never conflate the experiences of marginalised communities, as said earlier, we should not homogenise. I think that reflecting on parallels can help us learn and develop anti-racist solutions. So this project was funded by the Victorian Government and the Centre of Resilient and Inclusive Societies, and responded to a call made by the Race Discrimination Commissioner for more research into this area. I led a team of researchers at Western, including the fabulous Dr. Rachel Sharples in the corner there, and colleagues at Deakin, to conduct a national survey of just over 2,000 Asian Australians who were located across the continent. We asked them about their experiences of racism before the pandemic and during the pandemic, including the types of racism they experienced and witnessed, how frequently that racism occurred, the everyday context that it was experienced or witnessed, and how they responded to those racist incidents, be that reporting it, telling a friend, or doing nothing at all. We also asked a variety of health and wellbeing questions to understand the potential impacts of racism on participants, and I'm sure you all know or can imagine our results. After analysing the results, we published a report and a much shorter policy summary that was presented to our funding partners, as well as the Human Rights Commission, various government departments and community organisations. Perhaps most importantly, we returned findings to community, conducting a series of focus groups with young Asian Australians with two objectives. Firstly, to ask them what they thought of the findings and our research, and secondly, what they wanted us to do with it. Overwhelmingly, and this parallels, I think, the draft recommendations that we're chatting about today, is that our participants in the focus groups called for education, as the denial of racism and lack of understanding of what racism is and how we can respond and prevent it is in need of urgent attention. And this is not just at the policy level or at levels of management and leadership, but on the ground in everyday contexts. So in response to what the community wanted, we are co-developing a series of social media reels and tiles that provide educational information to both targets and witnesses and everyone in between. And we're co-developing this material with youth advisors in the Asian Australian community and an Asian Australian designer. The social media content will assist everybody in identifying racism, what it looks like, sounds like, feels like, what we can do, particularly as active bystanders, to support targets of racism and respond, and how we can prevent it. We're hoping to launch that content in November. This project has also been informed the Human Rights Commission's National Anti-Racism Framework and the Association of Independent Schools of New South Wales online teacher training, particularly on the topic of fostering intercultural understanding in the classroom. So I believe this project is a really good example of how anti-racism interventions, informed by up-to-date and meaningful academic research, can have potential for reach and impact. To finish up, I've also been asked to speak about strategies to ensure that the work is prioritised at all government levels. I can tell you from lots of experience that this is very difficult. We at the Challenging Racism Project are still working, however many decades on making sure that our research is reaching the right people and is affecting change. What I can say, and this parallels what Dr. Reynolds said earlier, is that data is key. Without data, it's difficult to convince governing bodies that racism is still an issue. Yes, many people are still in denial, and that it has real impacts on individuals across all aspects of life. And also, evaluation data is important to show what interventions can and do work. So that's it for me. Thank you for having me today, and I really look forward to some more discussion.
Thank you to my geographer friend. And I think there were 2 points in particular that I think are really important, and we haven't quite touched on it just yet, is that there is a denial of racism that takes place, and that is a denial of people's experiences, and I think that we need to really start counteracting that narrative. And the other one that we have touched on, and that's the point of this, is the work that Alanna has been doing around kind of really a focus on community and what community wants and what community need, and that's why we're here, because we're thinking through how do we think about these high-level recommendations at community level, right? Now, again, another friend. I didn't just invite my friends, they are incredible. We have Dr. Virginia Mapedzahama from the Diversity Council, Australia. And Virginia is going to speak to us, and really amongst all of the other work that she does, she's going to be speaking to us about race and employment and racism in employment. And the reason why I asked Virginia to speak to us was because I was quite taken by a recent report by DCA around racism in the workplace. And I think that we can have a lot of learnings about what we can do in order to counteract that. So, Virginia, would you like to come up?
Thank you so much, Kathleen, and thank you for having me. So as Kathleen said, I'm here to talk about, at least she asked me to talk about racism at work. So I'm here today being an African who's got her Diversity Council Australia hat on. So I'm going to talk about the work that we've been doing using a strength-based approach at Diversity Council Australia to actually address racism at work. So far, like I think almost every speaker who's talked today has mentioned racism against people of African descent. I mean, I feel like this is kind of like a no-brainer. This is like racism is what frames our lived realities and the way we move through this Australian space. As people of African descent. So that's what we've been doing at DCA. So DCA, for those of you that don't know who we are, it's not an Afrocentric organization. We're not just about Africans. We are about every kind of employee in Australia. We are the leading organization on anything to do with diversity, inclusion, and equity in Australian workplaces. What we have, what I think makes DCA quite unique is that it's got that employer perspective. Our audience is the employer, so we seek organizational change through talking to employers. So this work has been really, really close to my heart because the report that we all, I'm assuming, have read, talked in depth as well as about how we as people of African descent we experience discrimination in employment. And so if we want actually that inclusion, we need to actually make sure we're able to speak to employers in some capacity. And my little limited time working at DCA, this is something that's actually really, really difficult to do, because employers are about doing what works for organization, what needs to happen in organization. And it doesn't always align with the things that are happening to us as people of African descent in those organizations. So it's not a coincidence that you don't find us in leadership, you don't find us in certain kind of types of employment. It's not a coincidence, it's because there's rampant racism, and the racism that's systemic. And to date, racism has not been the center or at the focus of anything that's been happening on diversity and inclusion in Australia. What has been the focus has been stuff around cultural diversity, which is not to say that that's not important. We all know that, talking about cultural diversity and multiculturalism, it's important. I think Dr. Williams mentioned that we should, is she here still?
You didn't recognize that word.
Sorry, no, I'm looking right. But you talked about, I found it quite fascinating how you talked about, perhaps the notion of the concept of multiculturalism is outdated in Australia. We need to move on to other concepts, and I very much agree with that, because I think it has, among other things, in Australia masked any meaningful discussions around race and racism and how we deal with that in society broadly, but more so in workplaces. And so this thing is happening and nobody's doing anything about it. So what we did in 2021, we started a significant piece of research at DCA that was looking at what is happening with people of, what we were calling racially marginalized groups in Australian workplaces. So that question had never really been asked in Australia. So that piece of research is really significant because we've never really asked it. And this was really coming off the back of all the Black Lives Matter movement and all the stuff that was happening globally at that point. And we had our members come to us and say, hey, what do we do with this? Because we're actually hearing people telling us that actually this thing isn't an American thing, it's not stuff that's happening elsewhere, it's actually happening here as well. And so what do we do? So we did that piece of research. And it was really significant, like I said, because nobody else had ever asked that question, what is happening to lock people out of leadership roles, and what can organizations do about it? So we did that piece of research, landmark, and we're continuing that work. So for the last couple of years that I've been at DCA, a huge part of my role has been talking to our members. And when I keep talking about our members, DCA is a member-based organization. So most of the work that we do is actually targeted at those members. We've got about 1,300 members, which is about 25% or so of the Australian labour market in terms of the people that our members employ. So that's a significant audience base that we're kind of trying to speak to. And talking about racism to those members, a lot of the ASX 300 companies are part of our membership. And so that's a huge audience to talk about. And while we're not talking specifically about Africans in Australia, the topics that we're talking about really do relate to some of the experiences that we're doing, as Alanna was talking about. We're not homogenizing the experiences here, but we are going out about what's happening to people who are racially marginalized. So the last couple of years, I've been going to organizations with a strength-based kind of lens to talk to them about racism. Has not been an easy kind of task, it has not been an easy job, but what I've found is that there is actually, the appetite is out there, people actually want to know, but people don't know. So a lot of the things that we've been focusing on from our report, we found that the biggest thing that's locking people, or that's affecting or locking racism in place, in workplaces, is a very, very low racial literacy, or the lack of racial literacy, really. People don't know what racism is, they're not comfortable talking about it, and so they're not doing anything about it. So racism, discussions around racism or anti-racism or anti-racist work is actually not even on anybody's agenda. And so everything we've been doing for the last couple of years is really informed by that we need to actually educate employers about racism and really talk to them that when you're talking about cultural diversity, you're not actually talking about racism. When you're talking about multiculturalism, you're not actually talking about racism or anti-racism. So that's what we're starting. It's really kind of anti-racism 101 for most people in this room. I'm sure if you were to come and listen to any of the stuff that I'm talking to members about, you'd be like, isn't that like the basic thing? Like that's so obvious. But I've found, and we've gotten a lot of feedback that says actually in its simplicity, the message that you're kind of delivering is really, really important. And one of the things that we've been doing is talk about it. Literally just that. Just you gotta talk about it. If you're not talking about it, you're not fixing it. Like, you can't fix what you can't talk about. And so that's where we're starting in organizations. That we literally have a knowledge program that we've developed on anti-racism or racism at work, following on from the work that we did. And in that work, we have 1-2 hour session, literally just in educating employers about you need to talk about racism. How do you talk about it? You need to think of yourself as a racialized being. Because for a lot of people out there who don't have those experiences of racism, they're not actually walking around thinking, I'm a racialized person. They think racialized groups, those Africans, they are racialized, I'm not, I'm just a person. So you kind of start that basic of saying, no, actually you're also racialized, but you're not racialized negative. So it's that basic kind of work that we're doing that really empowers people to say, actually talking about racism is not a bad word, because in Australia, we kind of turned it into a bad word. We kind of started saying, let's not talk about it. In fact, I had a meeting one day, which was very frustrating, with some really powerful academics and ex-academics and policy people that were just like literally quizzing me. They're like, Virginia, we understand what you're trying to do with employers, but it is totally bad for you to start to talk about race. That's a bad thing. And they were like, it took us such a long time to take this out of Australian lexicon, you understand? And I was like, oh, that was dumb. You didn't need to do that. Well, I didn't say that, but in my seriously, like, can you like that? like seriously, because I'm like, well, we're here because of what you did, because you took it out of Australian lexicon, and now we have a whole generation of people that A, don't know that they're racialized, B, that don't know that race is a thing, and C, that don't know that I'm walking around as a racialized, negatively racialized body in Australia, and it is absolutely like everything that happens to me is because of that one thing, that I'm negatively racialized. Never mind that I'm not a woman who is African, who is this and that, like all of those other intersections come into it, like from that kind of basis. So it's those kind of basic things that we're sort of really, I guess, empowering organizations to start talking about, just that talking about racism is a good thing. We've been focusing on other basic things like getting people to understand that we have a history in Australia, and it's actually a racist past. Oh, sorry, I'm told it actually right around racist past, and that history didn't stay in the past. It's kind of coming here. So I often talk about how, as a person of African descent, when I walked into Australian space, I walked into space that was already predetermined by me because of that racist past. It was already predetermined for me, not by me, for me, because of that racist past. So I don't have control over the things that this society did to me because of that racist past. But most importantly, that it's not in the past, it's here with us today. So I talk a lot about coloniality as well in the work that we're doing at DCA. We've been talking to DCA a lot, to our members, a lot about the systemic nature of racism, because this is another thing in kind of building that racial literacy to get at people to understand. It's actually not all about the nasty things that we hear on the bus. And so I give an example of, as an African person in Australia, I've actually only been called nigger in public spaces only 3 times. Now that's 3 times too many, I get it, but it's only been 3 times in my 25 plus years of living in Australia. But yet my lived experiences in Australia are all framed within a narrative of racism. So if you start to think of racism in those big, nasty, there's an identifiable perpetrator kind of way, you're actually going to miss a whole lot of things that actually frame my lived experiences in Australia. So those are the kinds of things that we're trying to educate our members around, or employers around, and also debunking some of the myths around racism in Australia, that, oh, it's something that happens in the United States. Oh, they're really racist over there. Well, we are too. Also, if we talk about racism, we're bringing it into existence. Well, no, we're not. If we're talking about it, we're just actually bringing it to the fore. That's all there is. Because the reason we think it's not there, it's because we're not talking about it. So we're not creating it by talking about it. So a lot of the work that we've been doing with employers around understanding racism is starting from that basic thing of building racial literacy. That's it. That I promised Juliana I was going to talk about. This is what we've done since we've been doing the work on anti-racism or on racism at work, is we've now actually moved into exploring the intersections of race and other things. And what we focus on is the intersection of race and gender. And so while we're educating employers about understand that building that racial literacy, we've also started to talk about, well, actually, when you look at this, it's actually a little bit more complicated. It's not just about people experience racism and that's it, but different groups of people experience it differently. So we've been focusing a lot on women of color in organizations and focusing on their experiences. So we've just got a multi-million-dollar government grant. It's a huge grant that we're working with Settlement Services International and another partner who does women leadership stuff, to really look at what's happening with women of color in Australian organizations. Now, it's not Afrocentric, but it includes a lot of African women, and it is led by 2 African women, me and Juliana. So we are trying to talk to organizations in this space, even though we're not like limiting it to people of African descent, but we are talking about issues that affect us a lot.
Oh. I was hoping somebody would get it so I could take it home. First of all, congratulations, Virginia, on winning that money. It's a really big deal. I was just struck as I was listening to you when you were talking about having these conversations and the importance of having these conversations. And I think what's important for us here who are not negatively racialized is that, you know, we cannot expect those people who are negatively racialized to have these conversations, because that is just, you know, entirely on their own, because that's just an added burden. It's just another emotional labor that is expected of them to fix an issue that is not their issue. And so I think that's something that we could perhaps have a wider conversation about when we, I don't really like the word ally, kind of makes me feel a little bit creepy for a number of reasons. But what can we do as those who walk through the world along a path that's a lot easier? What can we do to have these conversations in a meaningful and informed way? All right, so next up, how are we going? Yeah, good, all right. We have Ms. Kirsten Keith, who is a human rights consultant and an executive committee advisor and lawyer for the AAAC. We've had a lot of conversations about today's presentation, and I'm really delighted that you've agreed to come and speak to us, because I think one of the striking things in the findings and the recommendations is that we genuinely have issues of human rights violations in Australia, and that we can't shy away from that. And so it's really important that we're having these conversations. So, Kirsten, if you'd like to come up.
So thank you, Kathleen, for inviting me today to come and talk. I'll be talking partly in my capacity as a AAAC member. And I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands which we meet today. I've come from the Gundungurra lands, somewhere between here and Canberra, further down in the south, and I'm still defrosting because it was 3 degrees when I left this morning. So I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. So, as has been touched on already today, the findings in the working group's preliminary report present a somber picture of human rights in Australia as they relate to persons of African descent. As mentioned in the report, there is a prevalence of racial discrimination in Australia, and the report contains a litany of human rights issues such as serious physical abuse and excessive use of force, deaths in custody, racial profiling, abuse of authority, over-policing, and then racial barriers to employment, education, health, and access to justice. That's it in a very small nutshell, as it were. It also importantly draws attention to the abhorrent practice of indefinite detention. This practice is clearly in breach of international human rights law, and the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, Dr. Alice Edwards, spoke about the practice, saying, when individuals spend more than 3 months in detention without an end in sight, being held in legal limbo, their treatment could begin to be classified as an enduring, degrading, inhumane, or psychological torture. And this clearly would be in contravention of Australia's obligations under the Convention Against Torture, as well as under the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights. However, the overarching theme of the report, as has been touched on earlier by various others, is that of racial discrimination. And on this, the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, has stated, racial discrimination is a deeply damaging and pervasive abuse of human rights and human dignity. It is one of the most destructive forces dividing societies and responsible for the death and suffering of a grotesque scale throughout history. That was in a speech that he gave earlier this year. So racial discrimination, as we're aware, is clearly prohibited under international human rights law. And in relation to human rights law, it's worth noting that Australia is a party to 7 major international human rights treaties, including the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and also the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, in addition to the rights of the child and the Conventions Against Torture and others. Yet, in spite of being a signatory to these core human rights treaties, with the accompanying obligations that they impose, Australia's domestic legal human rights framework fails to provide protection for everyone's human rights, as is apparent in today's discussions. This is due to what the Australian Human Rights Commission has stated is an implementation gap between the human rights standards that Australian governments have committed to uphold over many years and the actual protections in our laws, policies and processes of government. Any rights that are protected are located in diverse pieces of legislation, the common law and also the Constitution, which results in a fractured and incomplete human rights system that's not only complex to understand, it's difficult to navigate and makes it inaccessible to many, leaving many Australians lacking their human rights protection. To give some context to this, we have human rights charters at the state level. We have them in the ACT, Victoria and also Queensland. However, this still leaves some 13.7 million persons in Australia, in other states and territories, without full protection of their rights due to a lack of a comprehensive and national human rights legislation. This issue of a National Human Rights Act or legislation is currently being considered by the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Human Rights in Canberra as part of its review into the human rights framework. And it opened itself to submissions from various interested persons into this issue. So the AAAC has made a submission to the Joint Committee in support of a National Human Rights Act. This submission was driven by and a direct response to the working group's findings, which clearly point to the current human rights framework in Australia failing to protect the rights of those of African descent. The AAAC drew upon some of the working group's findings in its report in the submission to the Joint Committee to highlight the case for a National Human Rights Act, but also to raise greater awareness of the working group's findings itself. So key points for those who are perhaps less versed in human rights in the legislative side of it as to why a Human Rights Act is required. Firstly, the Act would ensure that the human rights of everyone are protected regardless of where they live. human rights are for everyone, they shouldn't be dependent on where you live. It would also expressly articulate Australia's human rights obligations and impose a positive duty on public authorities to apply a human rights lens from the outset when drafting decisions, laws and policies. It would require governments and their agencies to consider, respect and protect human rights when delivering services, including those service providers working on the government's behalf. So I make this point because I know that the working group's report referred to findings where service providers engaged in immigration support have been engaged in racist behaviour. So I think it's really important to think about service providers also being bound to apply a human rights approach in their work. A Human Rights Act will also help ensure accountability and compliance of human rights obligations, which would also thus help prevent future breaches of human rights from occurring. Also, a single Human Rights Act that is a single point of focus for the nation would help everyone to understand about their rights, and they would be empowered to seek justice if their rights are breached. Community organisations would have an important role to play in helping to raise awareness of human rights and helping others to understand about their rights. A national act also has the potential to foster a greater culture of understanding of and respect towards the rights of others. A society that respects the rights of all is one that is a fairer and more equitable society, one that we would all strive to be living in. So clearly, a national human rights act is not the only panacea towards addressing the issues that have been raised by the UN working group. However, it's a vital step in the right direction. Embedding human rights in a national legal framework would result in enforceable protections for all. The absence of a legally enforceable national human rights is perhaps one of the greatest gaps we have in human rights protection. And for these reasons, the AAAC felt it important to make this submission to the Parliamentary Joint Committee for Human Rights, calling for support for such an act. And the AAAC will continue its work advocating for a National Human Rights Act. And this is highlighting some of the community action that can be taken to advance the issues that the working group raises. The use of submissions that the AAAC has done provides community organisations with an opportunity to have their say on issues that directly impact on them, drawing on the insights and vital lived experiences that community organisations members have. The AAAC has similarly made submissions to the Senate in relation to COVID issues and also to the UN working group itself ahead of its visit to Australia. So beyond submissions to government in UN agencies and other bodies, community groups also have a tremendous role to play in raising awareness of human rights issues across diverse settings, including in engaging in community consultations. So for instance, during a meeting regarding the Respect at Work report that's recently come out, which is going to impose positive duties on employers to prevent sexual harassment and discrimination, the issue was about raising the need to adopt a multicultural lens while also advocating for an intersectional approach, so that sexual discrimination is not just viewed in a silo, but also in consideration of other issues such as racism and LGBTIQ concerns. The AAAC is pleased to be involved in various consultations, including with the Multicultural New South Wales Agency and also the Australian Human Rights Commission, advocating for the needs for African Australians and highlighting the issues raised by the UN Working Group. These are an important means of helping to shape the dialogue, ensuring that the rights are considered at the discussion table. In conclusion, I'll be on time, there's a great scope for community organisations to agitate for the protection of human rights through various means, either by themselves or by collaborating with other stakeholders, including academic institutions. With collaboration, we know that the message can be amplified and it becomes harder to ignore. As Dr. Barbara Reynolds mentioned earlier in her speech, the baton is being passed back to us. So now is the time to galvanise and come together to collaborate and advocate for an end to racial discrimination and the respect and promotion and protection of African Australians' human rights and human rights across Australia. thank you for the opportunity to speak today, and I'm looking forward to what will hopefully be an engaging and inspiring discussion afterwards. Thank you.
I think that was just such an incredibly important perspective for us to really take it back to the fact that we're thinking about human rights here, and the fact that we have people that are advocating for a National Human Rights Act, and that it takes so much work and agitation to get there. I mean, the halls, we do walk slowly down these halls, but we're walking nonetheless, and we're getting there. So thank you so very much. So last but certainly not least, in our little panel section is Dr. Atem Atem, who I know from various different parts of our lives. But today you'll be representing START as a Community Development and Evaluation Officer. Dr. Atem has just recently got his PhD from the Australian National University. And he's also the president of the New South Wales Refugee Communities Advocacy Network. Thank you so very much. Dr. Atem's come to talk to us about engaging community. And I think that's really important, because it's all very fine and well that we're having these conversations here. The people that know about this report and know about the visit are the people that are here. And I think that it's about how we engage with community, how we raise awareness, and then we move to how we get a feel for what they need and how we go forward. So thank you very much. There we go.
Okay. Thank you very much, Kathleen, for inviting me to speak today. Thank you for everybody. I'm going to try to do this really quick because I know time. And when I was putting this presentation together, it was actually this morning. So I had so much work. I was up until midnight last night because of work. As soon as I finish here, I'll go and continue doing that. So bear with me if it's not as succinct as the. But look, racism is something that structures our lives here. As the just told us, we know racism disempowers people, racism excludes people, racism isolates, racism silence, racism take away your dignity, as we have heard already. Racism also creates spaces that are very unsafe for everybody who's a victim of that. And one thing racism does is also mystifying structures. All the bureaucracy that we sort of need to engage with is so demystified, mystified, so that we don't understand how it works. And so we don't complain. So we don't see the racism. So in Australia, racism for me is embedded in all the structures. The whole system was based on racism, based on exclusion. So we are just part of that. We become part of that as Black people who migrate here or who were born here from African background and origin. Look, the job that I was told to do was that, which is a tough one because it's very difficult. And engagement around racism and issues like this is tough. And someone was talking about, our system in homogenizes. We are all Africans, so we have to say, but we are not. We are and that different carries weight. And we need to understand, that difference, because if we are talking about these approaches here, and these approaches are only important because they allow us to think about what we need to do and how we go about it. That's why they are important. They are not important just because someone came up with them. And note that they are all Western informed, so there's nothing African about them. So trauma informed, because I work at START, that's the framework that we use, and trauma informed is acknowledges that trauma is something that affects people throughout their life. If you experience trauma, it doesn't have to be refugee trauma. You know, it could be trauma as a child, it could be trauma from whatever source, it stays with you and it impacts your life and everything that goes around you. So, and for you to work with people, you need to ensure that they are safe, that you build trust with them, that they are empowered. So that's that approach. STEM-based approach that we've been talking about here is also about looking at strength of people. What do people have rather than what they need? That's the approach. So if we want to deal with this, we also have to look at ourselves as Africans. What do we have that we can use to resist this system? What do we have that we can use to actually fight this racism that we experience all the time? It's not just about us being victims, we also have something to contribute, and people have already mentioned that. And then I'll start to talk about social capital framework. And the social capital framework is basically really, was developed with refugee communities, and social capital is something already there. It's a well-known idea in academia, but what the start has done with the University of New South Wales was to come up with a framework that was specific to refugees. And what it says is that refugees and some migrants who experience violence, war in their countries, and people get displaced, that experience, what it does is it targets relationships. It takes away trust from them. That's how it works. You can't trust your friend, you can't trust your family, you can't trust anybody. Everybody is by themselves, although you are still together, but you trust nobody. It takes that agency away from you. And so what START does in this framework is to try to bring back that and to try to bring those relationships back through encouraging people to build relationship, encouraging people to build trust, encouraging people to build those norms that allow people to actually work together as communities, as groups, as family. And so that's that framework. And so again, safety is very, very important in that framework. So what I thought I would do is just to show you very quickly, and don't hang on the numbers because people think. What I'm trying to do here is to say our communities are very, very diverse. So if you look, and this is from 2021 census data, if you look at that African, continent, it's divided into North Africa, which is actually, it sits under Middle East. We have Central and Western Africa, and then we have Southern and East Africa. That's how the data is collected about us. And if you see here, the majority of us are from southern part of Africa, Southern East Africa. The thing to note here for me is some Africans don't think they are African, or they are more aligned with other parts of the world. Sudan, I come from Sudan. Well, South Sudan now. We have people in Sudan who would rather trace their origin to the Middle East than being proud of Africa. And that's fine, that's their choice. That's no problem with that. But that is what we are talking about. In Africa, we have people of European origin, right? Kathleen is here, we have people of Indian origin. We are all African. So when we talk about African descent, that's also problematic. That's not a discussion for now. But what I want to do is to say we are very diverse, and then also say in Australia, if you look at history and some selected communities, migration, the history of migration. If you look at the history of migration, we came here different times. You see the one that goes up there, the orange one, that's South Africa. South Africans have been coming to Australia forever. The blue one, Egyptian, they have also been coming. An Egyptian here? Okay. I can claim it. So people like us came about here. That's when we came. South Sudanese, other people. So the 2000, it seems like the 2000 to 2010 brought a lot of refugees from Africa and other people from Africa. So again, the point is we have diversity among us through the regions we come from, the times when we arrived here, and those play a role as well. We have some you know, if you look at age, you have age diversity, you know. I was actually a little bit shocked by this one because I looked at some data around South Sudan, like 2016 census, and I think I was looking at Australia. This is New South Wales. All this data is about New South Wales. So, and nationally, when I looked at the 2016 data last year, if you look at South Sudan, half of the population is 20 or under. Right? So, but this is New South Wales. So, yeah. So, but the point I'm making here, there is diversity in our age structure. And that is important to notice because the experience of young people is different from my experience of race. Language proficiency, you know, English is a big problem in this. If you don't speak English, you know, you are seen as lesser, and you will be more likely to experience racism. So here, you know, 80% of South Africans speak English only. You know, this is Zimbabwe speaking probably over 50%. And if you look at other places down here, like I think this is South Sudan, you know, the numbers are very low. But what I'm trying to establish here is that diversity. Okay, I'm told to move on. The level of education. What I want to point out here is look at how educated we are. All of us as Africans. There are some people who are more educated than others, but if you look at this, is the gray one is degrees. People are having degrees. If you look at that level, that's a strength by itself, right? Okay, local approaches. Now the engagement. What I'm, you know, sort of thinking about here is how do we do it? Because it's very, very hard. I think one of the things we need to do is to understand how people experience racism. The way I experience it is different from the way, you know, a female African, like just said, experience it. The way a young person experience it is different from, you know, the way other people experience it. The way my child who is born here experiences racism is different. The way Kathleen experiences, you know, racism, I don't know whether you do or not, it's different. You know, so I cannot assume but it's different. Anti-racism engagement, this needs to be something that actually engages people, and actually people feel that if they engage with it, they gain something from it. We can sit here, talk about racism till tomorrow. That doesn't change anything, and people won't engage. But if people feel that actually by engaging, there's something gainful they get from it immediately, people will engage. But talk, nobody wants to talk anymore. The engagement has to be about capacity building, building the capacity of communities, building the capacity of people, because that's the only way you could move people forward with these issues. Collaboration is very important. It was mentioned already. Advocacy was mentioned already by the first speaker. Very important. I think underpinning all these frameworks, if we want to work with our communities, we need to think about safety. And I'll give you a very quick, small example. 2-3 years ago, Paramara, I was entering a lift. There was an African woman who was, you know, who was there. You know, when you experience racism, you become an expert in reading body language. All the time, so I saw this woman flinching in a way that, I immediately sensed something's happening. And so she woke up. So went up, and then she came later on. It was the same event we were going. But the point is, I don't know what her experience is, you know, but the point is, by me just standing up there, she felt unsafe. Okay? There are stories in our African communities that people from the same community cannot sit in a room. Because things are happening in our countries that are affecting us here. And how can you sit with someone whose cousin has killed your brother in a room? You know, very difficult. So safety is important. Trust, we need to find a way of creating trust. We don't trust each other. I know a lot of people who would rather have a service provider who's a white person who may not even help them, serve them, than having me, who is from the same community, serve them. You know, there's an issue of trust there, because they don't trust me. They would rather go to this person who will not help them but they'll feel safe and they feel they can trust that person. Openness and accountability, we need to be accountable to each other. We need to be open to each other. Reliability, we need to be reliable, the things we do. We need to have confidence that when we say we are going to do something, we actually follow through. It's very important. Solidarity, we need to do that. Just a very quick example. A couple of years ago, and some people in the room were there. A panel of young people who have grown up in Australia. I think they were born in Australia, very well educated, speaking English very well, sitting there complaining about South Sudanese young people and humanitarian young people taking away all the. I walked out of that group in protest. I felt really sad, and I still feel sad about it, because these are our African brothers and sisters, young people sitting there complaining about other African young people. It's terrible. It shouldn't have happened. Yeah, and then mobilizing resources. This work, if we do it voluntarily, we don't have the time. Like I said to you, when I started, I had to do this morning because I didn't have the time. Yeah. So we need, if we are going to get this recommendation going and something done about them, we need resources to pay people to actually do it as their job. So that's important. I think this is the last slide. If we want to engage with the system, I think some of the things that have been here have been already talked about. We play the political game. What's the political game? Know your issue and know it really well. Not just turn up and say there is racism. You can't provide any more information about what that is. Evidence has already been talked about. Provide the evidence that is needed. Understand the institutions. They are very mystified. Have to be sort out how they work and understand them properly. Because if you don't, you are creating a problem for yourself. Anybody you talk to will go, this institution is doing this and that. Understand your local politics and get involved, because if you don't, nothing happens. And then know your MPs and engage with them. Thank you very much.
I feel like the horrible person that, like, internally I'm like, I want you to keep talking, I want you to keep talking, but like there's a little voice that's going, we're gonna get kicked out of this room and hurry things up. So I'm so sorry for that. There's just so much there, Atem, that I would love to pick up either in our conversation time or over lunch. I think the homogeneity narrative is a really big thing that myself and Christina Rocha have come across again and again in our work. Africa is a continent, it's not a country, and I think that homogeneity narrative really kind of plays into these sort of racial tropes, right? Because it's easier to just see a group of people that are negatively, brown skin, black skin is easier, everyone is the same, you can treat them all the same. It's really, really problematic. I absolutely love the social capital framework. I'd like to speak to you about that at some point. And I also, if I can get your slides, Atem, because I think those strategies are really key. And I think one of the strategies that you mentioned is about like engaging with politicians, knowing who your representatives are and writing them hard. You said it much more eloquently than that, but I think that that's what we need to do. Right. I know that we are like, we're on the downhill, there is food coming. What I will say is like maybe we can give ourselves about 5 minutes worth of a break just for a walk around. I'm going to shave off some time in the conversation part of it. So maybe we'll kind of limit that to about 20-25 minutes.
There, Kathleen, so that's
the food is there.
Yeah. So they were.
You're more than welcome to. How do we all feel? If you want, you can bring the food in here and eat while we have a conversation. How do you feel about that? Yeah. Is that good? Yeah. Oh, thank you for the heads up. All right, let's go get food and then we'll come back and chat. Just trying to get people's attention. Thank you to Christina Rocha for highlighting that the food is outside so we could just eat inside. And what I might do, I know this is an opportunity for everyone to have a bit of a chat. Tori, the amazing Tori, the event manager extraordinaire, has a little lapel mic because our actual mic, this one over here, isn't working. So we currently don't have any questions online, but I'll sort of keep an eye on what's going on there. Is there any comments or questions in the room? Oh, hello, great.
Who would like to go first? Yes. Oh, it's a tiny little testing. You can hold it, or you can put it on your shirt.
Oh, before you start, I'm so sorry. Before you start, because we kind of ran over, we have a bit of a change to the program. So we're going to run this question and answer time till about 1:05, and then we're going to flip things just a little bit, where Professor Stout will come up and give some thoughts and some closing remarks about, sort of high-level stuff, and then we'll have Delphine and Daniel and Noelle speak afterwards. Because we ran over time, my bad. We kind of needed to flip things a little bit. All right, sorry to interrupt.
Hello, can you hear me? Is it working? Okay. So my name is Olivia. I'm an international aid worker, and I've just returned from 6 months in South Sudan, and I'll hopefully be going back there next month. So I've got time to be in Australia, fortunately, which is my home. So I have questions related to something Barbara said and to something Virginia said. But I'll start by saying this. I was at a meeting with a politician, so he talked about politicians in the last one, with a politician whom I respect. And we were talking about the voice to Parliament for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And we were talking, how are we going to, talk about either the yes case or the no case respectfully? And one of the things he wanted to say, well, now that Australia is no longer a racist country, so I stopped him. I said, we cannot say that, especially not in the multicultural, sorry to use that word, multicultural communities. He didn't know what to say, but this shows education we have to do. So the issues I want to raise, Barbara said something about Black Australians, and I'm thinking, she knew very well what she was saying. Hi, Barbara, I hope you're there. But
I think she might
that
be, yeah.
terminology does not mean the same as what you might think it means if you're in the UK or America, because the first Black Australians are the Aborigines. And the issues the Aborigines face are different from what we face. So, question 1, who is a Black Australian, and how do we deal with this? Second one, from what Virginia said, was talking about, what is racism? And one of the things I found, people think racism is when you are making a deliberate insult. You are calling somebody da-da-da, and that means it's racist. This is in the general population. They don't understand that racism is in the everyday things you say. And even if you say something and it's not a deliberate insult, it is still racism. But they don't get that. There's this quivering, it's like, you can't say I said something racist. It's not possible because I'm not a racist at heart. So this is more the education. So I just wanted to raise those 2 points. Thank you.
Sorry, just behind you.
Oh,
Can I just say something very quick before I leave? Otherwise, I will not do service to myself.
Look,
I'll be very brief. I understand. I had a chat with you, so respectfully stating this. I work for the Department of Home Affairs. I'm pretty sure a lot of you guys have seen the multicultural review framework that have been put out for submission. And this submission will close on the 29th of, let me get this right, 29th of September. The core for this submission really talks about access and equity. I do encourage members here to really take their time to submit. Because in the end, if we just see these crucial documents, again, this review have now been put in place for many years, for almost more than what? When did we start multiculturalism in Australia? It's been forever. So first time being reviewed, let's make our voices heard, take the opportunity to put in a submission. If you think the concept is outdated, state it. If you want to suggest anything, do so, please. Thank you.
Well, I'm going to talk about local responses because that's what we are here for. Let me start with talking about what Virginia said, that the structures for the racial discrimination that we endure in Australia were set for us prior to our arrival. So the structures are in place. Also, being somebody from Ghana, a British colony, I fully understand divide and rule. For a very long time, and for about a year, 2005 to 2006, I spent the year going around Australia talking about one thing to government agencies, that if they don't take their eyes off Africanness and look at our individuals, communities, they will not give effective services to people from the African continent. Whilst we did that, there were other members of our community who turned around and said we were all African. Hence our situations as they are. We need to speak one language. Divide and rule is what has been the system, and therefore if we don't speak one language, we will continue to be in a situation where we cannot progress. So let's be clearly aware of that agenda. The second point is what Atem talked about the point, the matter of the panel that was at a conference. I remember in 2011, the year of African descent, African Women Australia held a national conference for people of African descent, and there were various panels. Now, for Atem to remember that is very interesting because I remember it too. But for us to seek local responses and collaborate, we need healing hands. Our community needs to heal. I don't know how we're going to do it, whether we're going to do it on an annual basis by holding or committing ourselves to a healing process, or coming together for the first time and having conversation about what is hurting us, what is breaking us apart, what are the issues that if we don't come together around will continue to hurt us into perpetuity. We cannot go forward together in collaboration. So I'm asking for a session around healing. Let us bring the healing hands together and then we can progress with the way we need to go. Otherwise, we cannot face the enemy metaphorically. Thank you.
Nobody wants to talk, so I'll use the time. Clement Meru, Settlement and Community Programs Manager at Seedwest Multicultural Services. I'm also the chair of the African Alliance, New South Wales. A lot has been said, and I think we have a challenge ahead of us. I'm glad actually that Atem was the last speaker because he gave a lot of things for us to think about moving forward. I like strategy, and so straight away my mind started, working. I think one of the challenges for us as African communities around how we collaborate. First of all, collaboration is really important. There are different African groups and subgroups, and it's important that, referring to, borrowing words from the mayor this morning, we don't want to leave anyone behind. How do we do that? We need to socialize this with different groups. It's important that we identify who needs to be part of the conversation, but most importantly, how do we build the capacity of the different groups to be able to make representations on some of the issues and being effective in addressing the issues that were raised this morning and the issues that were raised in the report, including the recommendations. All of us do a lot of great work individually, and unfortunately, it falls on only a few individuals who, on top of what they are already doing, there's a lot of demand for them to step up, and it's very exhausting. And if we are not careful about how we use our social capital, there's a risk of us losing those few key individuals. On behalf of the Alliance, we are happy to coordinate with with a group of stakeholders, including the AAAC, to see how we can take this forward. Thank you.
Oh, Rosemary first. Yeah. I just have a couple of comments and questions from online.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Liz Moturi. Are we cold in Australia? So learning a lot by being here today. And I love the conversations and the discussions that have been ongoing. So maybe a comment and a question, because from what Dr. Gatwiri said in the morning about how do we clothe ourselves, how do we regain back the dignity, and piggybacking on Dr.'s comment here on that 2 reasons why Dr. is doctor in Swahili. 2 reasons why we come is to take refuge and to take opportunities, as Dr. Alfred had mentioned. So I would have loved to see or to hear more on entrepreneurship. How are we equipping the Africans who are coming? How are we equipping them to be self-sufficient? How are we providing the knowledge and the resources and abilities to make them feel dignified, where the skill set you're coming with, how can you now take the opportunity to grow from that point, where you now elevate based on the better networks that you're going to generate by being here? How are you now getting to the next level? Are there programs? Are there mentorships? And we also heard from Dr. Atem, there's a very big group of youth. How are we redirecting them from getting lost? The statistics talked about the youth being incarcerated. So to divert them from that and give them employability or even skill set that can make them self-sufficient by starting their own entities, by learning how do you do that in this different setup that's not back home. Thank you.
Yeah, good afternoon. My name is Rosemary Karaoke, and I work with the New South Wales Police as the multicultural community liaison officers, and I wear different hats. Just to add on what Clement said about all of us coming together, and what Atem talked about the MPs, we need to know the politics. We need Africans to be represented in all areas, because using the education, how will we educate people and we are not in those tables where people are discussing? We need our people to be represented in every area of where people are sitting to talk. I sit in a body called Australian Multicultural Council. And everyone there, they talk about the issues in their communities. And I took, during COVID, they stopped the funding they give to third world countries for education in masters. And when I found out why did they remove the African continent was dropped from that list. So I asked the minister, why did they drop the African continent from that funding? You know, the question I got, the answer I got, not from him, but what it was happening that because of COVID, which continent or country was not hit by COVID? But that excuse they used. And if you are not in the discussions, how would you know something like that is happening? So the minister left, another minister came, and I never stopped. I pushed, but today it is reinstated because I pushed for it. And that's why we need even politics. We have no people in politics. So, and if you don't have anyone there who will bring your whatever issues you are having, this racism we are talking about, they don't know about because we are talking it in on the sides. But if we have our own people inside there, we gonna be hard. Even if they don't do anything that time, the other person will do something. So let us as Africans put our foot in every conversation in this country. Thank you.
So I'm just trying to, because again, time, I'm conscious of time.
I just want to raise, sorry, that was very close. So there was just one question, but I think it speaks really to the conversations that we're having here from Dr. Vinagu, and he writes, how best can we broaden and raise the profile of advocacy against racism and build allies in civil society, community, parliament, and government? That's not something that we can answer now today, but I think it's important that that question is asked, because perhaps that's the next event, right? Because we need to be thinking about what we do after this. This is the first step. What's the next step? So thank you very much for that contribution. I also then just want to read a comment. We've had a couple of technical issues. So I just want to read out a comment by Gloria Tabby, and then we'll go to Professor Stout. She writes, thank you to all the presenters for their excellent work. I want to echo what Dr. Reynolds spoke about. 1, economic independence. 2, education and advocacy. None of these 2 recommendations will address what an individual can do. Why don't we ever speak about the mechanisms that create racism? Because we can't fix the problem that we can't understand. And race, the technology behind racism, is not understood to why racism persists. Could the approaches be not fit for purpose, perhaps? I would have liked to have spoken it out. Yes, sorry, Gloria, I would like you to have spoken it out as well. But again, food for thought. And I also just wanted to pick up on your discussion around entrepreneurship. And I think that kind of links in a way to what Virginia was discussing as well, but I think there needs to be more conversation as well about empowerment and entrepreneurship. Because it's when we have financial capacity, we then also have capacity to exert power in other places. And I think that's really important. All